Me. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the latest in our series of leadership masterclasses, sponsored by Rathbones. My name is Kirsty Maxey. I'm the chair of the IoD City Financial Services Interest Group and CEO of Team Spirit. Tonight, we're very excited to hear from the General, Sir Richard Barrons, but before we meet him, let me tell you a little bit about the Institute of Directors. Here, we believe that better directors make better businesses. And for just £35 per month, membership provides you with access to a whole range of useful business tools, from networking to tax and legal advice, and also professional training. This event is part of the IoD Business Extra webinar series, which is providing insight and networking opportunities for all of our members. On the next slide, you can see the agenda for the evening, which focuses on the interview. And there are two ways you can get involved at the bottom of your screen. Firstly, you'll see a chat button. Do use this to let us know where you're dialing in from. So share your details with other attendees. And there's also a special LinkedIn post in the chat box. And all you need to do is comment, and then you can connect with all the other attendees. Secondly, if you want to ask questions, use the Q&A button. So if there are any questions you'd like to ask this evening, they will be taken from the Q&A section. The great thing about the Q&A is that you can upvote questions that you like and want to see answered. So chat button to introduce yourselves to all of the attendees, Q&A button for all the questions. Finally, just to let you know that this webinar is being recorded. And now I'd like to introduce you to our sponsor of the Leadership Masterclass series, the Client Development Director of Rathbones, Colin Monton. Colin works with senior decision makers and entrepreneurs, providing investment and wealth management services to their clients. Welcome, Colin, and over to you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Kirsty, and I'm delighted that Rathbones continues our sponsorship of the Institute of Directors Speaker Series. Our thanks to Alastair King and, crucially, of course, his team behind the scenes who have worked tirelessly, no doubt, to secure such interviewees. Now tonight, I have the privilege and the honour to provide opening remarks in such esteemed company as General Sir Richard Barrons KCB CBE, ex-commander of the Joint Forces Command. Now, Alastair, I understand you will be in conversation with General Sir Richard Barrons on his personal views of leadership during these challenging times and during adversity. At Rathbones, we appreciate that leadership can take many forms, and while I would be speaking out of turn, of course, to compare leadership on the front line with that of ourselves as a leading national wealth manager, I understand, General Sir Richard, that moral courage and doing the right thing is the foundation of training at Sandhurst. And at Rathbones, we believe that doing the right thing is at the very heart of leadership. Now, as a 280-year-old wealth manager, I am proud that we have a long history of doing the right thing. And if you indulge me for a few moments in a mini history lesson, William Rathbone V in the 19th century was a reformist supporting the fantastic Kitty Wilkinson in establishing washrooms and public baths during the cholera epidemic. And in the early 20th century, Eleanor Rathbone was a pioneer of the family allowance, women's rights, and was a key figure in the suffragette movement. But what of the now? Well, today we have played a critical and active role in drafting recent modern slavery legislation for the UK government, and we are proud supporters of our work with the Trussell Trust, a charity with a network of food banks, and our work with Mental Health UK. We also believe we have a responsibility to the community, and we encourage our colleagues to volunteer their time for local causes close to their hearts. The team and I believe that long-lasting, trusted relationships are developed through careful nurturing, understanding what matters to you and your family, and for many business leaders in today's Zoom, helping to give you visibility over your financial future by aligning the ambitions of your business with that of your family. And we do this by surrounding you with a team of professionals, be that investment managers and financial planners or our legal and tax team, all attuned to your needs and focused on your objectives. We're also strong advocates of education, and through our financial awareness courses, we focus on how investment markets work and the value of financial planning, thus giving you the tools to make informed financial decisions. So in summary, we believe in doing the right thing. We believe in thinking, acting, and investing responsibly. That's enough from me. On behalf of Rathbones, enjoy the rest of the evening, and Alastair, over to you. Thank you. Thank you, Colin. Lovely to hear you. And thanks again for Rathbones' great support of this Leadership Masterclass interview series for the IoD. It's with great excitement that I'm going to introduce our guest this evening, General Sir Richard Barrons. General, good to see you. Thanks very much indeed for being here today.
No, it's my pleasure.
Great news. Now, General, instead of me trying to introduce you, I'd like you to introduce yourself. If you could say a little bit about yourself, where you came from, what you did and what you do now, I would be most grateful.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to start the evening with my obituary, as usual. So I joined the army when I was 18, actually the same age I went to Oxford University to read philosophy, politics and economics. I joined as a university cadet. I had to stay for 5 years. I didn't really think I would do many more than that. And 39 years later, I had somehow omitted to leave. And my career reflected the age that we were living in. So roughly 10 years focused mostly on the Cold War and the situation in Northern Ireland. So I spent a lot of time living in Germany, as one did in those days. And then, frankly, very inconveniently, the Cold War finished, which is an existential crisis for armies, navies and air forces after so many years of having something major to focus on. And the next 10 years, which were a surprise, were mostly about the Balkans. I was in and out of Croatia, Bosnia particularly, and latterly completed a tour in command of my regiment in Kosovo. And then the world turned again, and the next 15 years were dominated by essentially Iraq and Afghanistan. And my first tour in both those places was as a colonel, and my last tour in both those places was as a major general. And at the end of the Iraq-Afghan experience, I then, as happens to so many officers, ended up in London, first as the Deputy Chief of Defence Staff running all the UK's operations. So I had charge of the intervention into Libya, the conclusion of our combat operations in Afghanistan, and I supervised the support to the fantastic London Olympics, which went from we don't want any soldiers at all to could we have 18,000, with the last 3,000 invited to turn up at about 2 weeks' notice. I completed my time in uniform full-time as Commander Joint Forces Command, and the UK is unusual in that we have an Army, Navy, Air Force and Joint Forces Command, and I led, as it were, the bits in the middle. So I was responsible for defence intelligence, for special forces, for operational command and control. I commanded all UK's permanent overseas bases, including things like the Falklands and Cyprus. I supervised the Defence Academy, so all, as you like, adult education for people from about major up in the armed forces. And I even supervised Defence Medical Services and operational logistics. And I bought all of Defence's information and surveillance capability. So for my last tour, I was responsible for about 23,000 people and spent about 4.3 billion of your money. All good things come to an end. So I've now been in the afterlife for 5 years, and I'm, I think, a fairly respectable portfolio mercenary. Half my week I spend working as an employee of a firm called CAE, and I help them in their campaign to develop and take around the world what are called single synthetic environments. These are replications of great scale and complexity of entire countries or even entire alliances based on combinations of high-end digital age capability. It's a fantastic thing, and I have been part of this idea since I was Commander Joint Forces Command. The other half of the week, I lead Universal Defence and Security Solutions, which we might talk about. That's the single biggest repository of former Army, Navy, Air Force, and MOD civil service expertise, and we span from strategy and policy down to functional support like training and education. And I also lead Witchwood Partners, which is a very small, very high-end cyber strategic consultancy. And my partners are the former senior leaders with me in UK cyber, so from the Secret Intelligence Service, MI5, the National Crime Agency, and GCHQ. And then in the time left over from that, I do some media work, and I do some bits and pieces, mostly to do with, frankly, leadership and leadership education. And that just about fills my life today.
Oh, wonderful. No, that sounds fantastic. You mentioned cyber. I'm particularly interested to hear your views on that. And I think perhaps you can give us an overview of your thoughts are in relation to the current threats to the United Kingdom, both physical and cyber. Essentially, which threats concern you most at the moment?
So I think well established on record of arguing that the UK is at increasingly great risk, and that not many people, frankly, really want to think about this. And I can break it into certainly 4 major themes. The first theme is every single day the UK's interests, security, and prosperity is being confronted by states that don't wish us well, and the obvious candidate there right now would be an aggressive, though clearly declining, Russia. And this confrontation, for the most part, has acquired the label of being hybrid or grace-based or tolerance confrontation, because it's conducted with all the levers of power available to the opposition, short of actual military fighting. It does include the use of military forces to do lower end, out of sight things like inspect our undersea cables, that kind of thing. But this hybrid confrontation is designed to destabilize us as a country, keep us off balance. It's actually not new. States have confronted each other forever. But the forms in which this occurs, which includes cyber and tinkering around in our social media, those really are new. So this hybrid confrontation, that's the risk that we confront every single day. The second risk, which I think we've seen very clearly through the effects of the pandemic, is just to consider how fragile our civilization is, the way we live in the UK, and indeed any other similar country. Now, this is a vulnerability to, of course, natural and man-made disaster, but also to the sort of confrontation that I described. And if you recall just how quickly our daily national life was eroded by the effect of the pandemic, you can get a sense that if people really wish us harm, we have consciously or unconsciously dismantled the resilience of our civil society, even as citizens. Very few of us think that if something terrible happens, that it's our job to sort it out. We seem to think the government will fix it. So that's my second concern. The third concern really rests on an analysis about how the world is changing so considerably. And we have talked for a generation about the post-Cold War era, the period from about 1990 onwards. And many of the ways we think about our security and prepare for it are based on that post-Cold War trajectory. And I'm very firmly in that camp of people who argue that world has gone. And I argue that the future for us all going forward, frankly, whether we want it to or not, is going to be dominated by the confluence of three big factors, and that is the rise of China as the dominant economic and to some degree political and possibly military force in our world over time. And that will occur in step with mankind for the first time in our history bumping into the limits of our planet's enthusiasm to manage our demands, abuse, and expectations. And as we know well, that is going to disrupt entire states and the relationship between states. And the third of my big three is this is the digital age, and we're going to deal with a transformation of how we live and work and play, and surely how we fight, which is going to be as profound as the onset of steam or electricity or gunpowder. And those three things, the rise of China, the bumping into the limits of our planet's ability to manage us, and the digital age, in some combination, mean that many of the things we've just assumed worked in the world, the so-called international order or the rules of trade, are going not to be guaranteed in the way that we once wanted to imagine. And for a country like the UK that relies on an orderly world for trade, but also for a lot of food and energy and money, that is a concerning thing that we have to learn to influence and control with our partners. And the fourth risk, and this is a bit techie, is because the digital age is changing how we live, work, and play. It is already changing how we fight in a way that is the most significant change for our armies, navies, and air forces for at least 150 years. And the UK, if it doesn't keep up with it, will remain as vulnerable as it is now to people if they choose to cause us great military harm, because they could right now, and we'd be pressed to do anything about it. Back to you, Alastair.
No, thank you for that tour d'horizon. My thought is really with that background, particularly those three great forces: China, limits to growth, and digital age. How did you react to the contents of the Defence Command paper that was announced to the House of Commons by Ben Wallace on the 22nd of March? Did it fill you with dread, or did it fill you with some hope that people have actually got a handle on these things?
Well, thank you. I should know not to have too high a set of expectations around defence reviews, because every single one of them in living memory has fallen short. There is always a gap between the stated ambition, all the good things you'd like to have or to do, easy words to write, and the resources that are meant to deliver those outcomes. And that gap is usually closed by a combination of hope and simply Herculean assumptions about magic efficiencies that the armed forces will conjure up. However, this review was particularly important, I think, for two reasons. The first was it had to acknowledge that world I've described, and I'm delighted to say it spends about 10 pages doing that. It says, forget the post-Cold War trajectory. The world is going to be different. We're going to have to manage it, contribute to it in a different way. So I gave it a tick VG for grasping a new strategic environment, at least the first step. The second thing that I thought was good and had been well telegraphed is that it begins, for defence anyway, to set out this path of modernization and transformation in the way that armies, navies, and air forces will change to be restored to competitiveness through things like artificial intelligence and secure cloud and connectivity and quantum computing and biosciences and robotics and autonomy. All of those things profoundly important. It says that's going to happen, and at this point, I think it falls short. The first thing which I regret is that there's a very long list of things that the government is going to do. I mean, it's a very impressive list of very worthy things. I actually can't argue with. It says we intend to do this, or we will support this or that. And then it occasionally says, and we'll apply this small packet of people and this small packet of money over time to those problems. And I think we have yet to break out of the perils of tokenism where we can declare we have to deal with a really, really major problem, but because financially we're a bit strapped or don't want to make difficult choices, we're going to tackle that really, really big problem with a minister making a phone call, a couple of million, and 3 clever people in the Foreign Office. And tokenism has worked in the past to some degree, but actually I don't think, certainly since about 2010, it is not going to work in this harder, sharper, more uncertain world I've described. So I regret the mismatch at this point between defining a difficult world and then trying to service it with noble, good, thoughtful, but insufficiently well-resourced tokens. And then there are a couple of things I think I do regret. The first thing is simply to save money. There are reductions coming quite quickly in the older bits of the defence inventory, and about 10,000 soldiers will let go. I'm sure we'll come back to that. But the destination that's been announced, this transformed military, is a very long way away. And the gap between making these cuts and arriving at the new solution, it can't be terribly well articulated because they've got to work it out. But it's long, and it's far longer, in my view, than a difficult, dangerous world would really tolerate. And the final thing I regret is it resurrects the fusion doctrine, which is absolutely right. This is the government's thoughts from March 2018 about how we make our way in the world as a country by fusing military power and government soft power, but also in some way to be defined the power of the UK private sector. And we should be in no doubt that around the world, the thing that really makes the UK most influential is the private sector. And so on the one hand, we're confronted by states like Russia, and I think at least in a while, China, who fuse their military, public sector and private sector as only a monolithic force can in order to deliver their national outcomes. And we have explained we need to do that, but we've not really articulated how we're going to do it. And we've definitely not grasped fusing what the government is trying to do with what the private sector is capable of in all sorts of ways. And I think we're playing this hybrid conflict, which is what fusion is about, with one hand tied behind our back. But in sum, at least this report begins to recognize that the post-Cold War era is over, and I would say the post-Cold War is over, and we are now pre-war, and we need to think in a completely different way about this uncertain world.
If I can touch on what you said about the biggest headline was the cutting of 10,000 posts in the army, and the second biggest headline was perhaps that there was a allocation of some £85 billion for kit. And I just wonder whether, certainly some people thought that perhaps it's investing too much on kit, such as autonomous aircraft and swarming drones and all the rest of it, rather than in personnel. Do you think the balance is a long way from where it should be, or do you think it's it's an impossible task?
So I can make a very plausible argument about what this transformation of armies, navies, and air forces looks like, and it is profound. So we're used to thinking about an army, navy, or air force as essentially quite a small number, recently very small number of expensive platforms, ships and aircraft and tanks, manned by quite a large number of people. But where we're headed is an inversion of that paradigm, where as armies, navies, and air forces become a mixture of manned, of course, still unmanned. You don't save any people really there, but increasingly autonomous capability. We're going to have quite a lot more equipment, which will be cheaper to buy and simpler to operate, manned by relatively fewer people. So you can make an argument that in the future we may need smaller numbers of regular manpower, but that is a future which is some way off. And right now there is an unfortunate dichotomy between saying we're going to go down that road and then cutting people and kit that we have right now, when we've got to manage the gap between what the MOD would describe right now as sunset capability and the future which it'll define as sunrise capability. And in that future, we are going to have to manage this uncertain world. So we're going to have to restore our resilience. We may have to do bigger things for longer. We may have to do more than one thing at once. We may have to contemplate mobilizing not just the armed forces, but aspects of civil society. And to do all of those things, numbers of people will matter. So I think financial imperatives have driven these cuts, but they are at odds with our own strategic logic. And I regret that. I think we'll have to put it right.
Could I concentrate particularly on the cyber threat, which you mentioned earlier, General? You've got a city involvement through a long association with the HAC, and you therefore also, through your consultancy, you're able to assess how the UK financial sector's preparedness for cyber attack sort of lies. And I'd be interested to know your views as to sort of whether the threat is from state actors or through terrorism, and how prepared are we as an economy for the threats that lie ahead of us.
So I think the good news is that certainly in the financial sector, the vast amount of money has been deployed by, frankly, very skilled people to protect our financial systems, and it's one of the stronger and most resilient bits of the economy. But it's not complete. But I think it's still true to say that the extent of cyber risk is not completely understood, and with Witchwood in particular, encounter regularly the same errors. And the first of those is people aren't sure where the threat is coming from. And the threat is a combination of really three big divisions. The criminal, quite often exceptionally well organized and funded. And the criminal is interested in money and intellectual property, and will thieve it or ransom it or acquire it one way or another. And this is organized crime of our time, and it's the one that people focus on. The second threat are state actors, and they're often interested in different things, either disruption or information. And the fact is, some states will use the best organized cyber criminals to do their work for them, because that's where the great capabilities. And then there is the third actor, which can be quite talented but is smaller, and that is the hacktivist or activist, or sometimes just, frankly, a very gifted teenager in their bedroom who's found a way into someone's network. So we've got to manage those three divisions. The second common error is I still find people who think that cyber is somehow a technical problem, that it's for the CIO or the chief technical officer, or it's something that the IT people will vaguely deal with. Well, this risk, by far the biggest risk to the future health of most enterprises, is a board C-suite risk. And it seems to me odd that boards will talk about other risks, including health and safety, but somehow not the cyber risk. I think this is declining. But the companies that are going to manage cyber risk are those companies where the chairman and the CEO are making cyber just an integrated part of their holistic risk management, and setting an example. I mean, without telling too many tales out of school, if someone like me in my former life wanted to break into a commercial organization for whatever reason, I'd normally start with the CEO, because they're too busy and too important to abide by the rules that the staff have set. And I definitely go after the non-executives, because they like the board papers sent to them on their Gmail accounts, and I can find a way in very satisfactorily that way. So personal example. I think those boards that do accept cyber risk as a generic corporate risk, they then do a number of things pretty well. First of all, they understand the risk cannot be totally defeated. So you can't spend all your money on a firewall and think that will do, because your biggest risk is often the insider risk, whether it's negligence or inexperience or worse. So balancing the management of that risk between people and process and technology, I think we're getting better at it, but we're by no means completely there yet. Boards should then accept they can't manage the whole risk, so protect the things that really matter. It doesn't really matter if your fish tank is hacked in the entrance hall, although it did matter in one casino in Las Vegas, because it was through the fish tank thermometer that the criminals got into the database of high rollers. It was just an odd thing to do with your network. So understand the things that matter, protect that on a risk managed basis. And then please assume, because you will be hacked. People will get in. And the companies that survive are those that accept that, have a plan, have rehearsed the plan, and then enact it, led by the CEO when they are penetrated. And then most people go, well, okay, they managed that well. Everyone crack on. Those companies that somehow think it won't happen to them and ignore the problem of contingency can be swept away on the back of frankly, devastating effect on their data and networks.
That's fascinating, and thank you also for giving us some practical steps for our businesses, such as not using the Gmail accounts for non-execs and all the rest of it. That's very, very helpful. You mentioned earlier about universal defense and security solutions. Could you say a little bit about what that does? Also, can you give me an example of the type of engagement that UDSS might undertake, and what sort of deliverables UDSS might make for that client?
So UDSS was born out of two concerns. The first one was, and still is to some degree, there are an awful lot of very talented, gifted people who have served in the Navy, Army, Air Force, MOD, Civil Service, and other bits of the Civil Service who have completed their public service career. Now that might be in their mid-50s, or it may even be in their 20s or 30s. And they've acquired skills and expertise and a working culture and ethics and characteristics which are highly employable, and they want to put those to good use. But actually the mechanism for taking those people in their after service life and applying it in the commercial world is poor. There are various schemes and measures to address this, but I found an awful lot of what I take as my constituency, who were living even half their life, half their working life, frankly, underachieving, underemployed, underpaid, and unable to find a way of breaking in. And the second side of this was I found quite a lot of military people who in starting into the commercial world were underplaying their skills by miles. They were doing things that were well beneath their skill set and experience. And that's sometimes because the commercial employers didn't know what to make of them. And others were frankly being taken advantage of because they didn't know how the commercial world operated. So I decided with Peter Hewitt that we would put this right. We've created Universal Defense and Security Solutions, and we are by some distance the biggest repository of former Navy, Army, Air Force, MOD, Civil Service staff. We now have about 400 people on our books, and we range from 4-star, 3-star, the board level, down to warrant officers at the lower level. And our focus is on governments and armed forces around the world and industry. At the level of governments, we will advise people on how to create good defense policy, how to articulate that policy into strategy, how to think about the capability, which is people, equipment, and training and support that they need to deliver that strategy, and then how to actually acquire it without going through all the agonies that many countries go through in their military acquisition. At the next level down, we offer more functional support. So we have a very large professional military education team. It's about 70 strong, and we provide education to obviously armed forces around the world, but increasingly into business, where we have a leadership offer and teach people to plan and that kind of thing. And then other folks want specialist stuff from us. They want to know about how do you shoot a drone down, how do you secure your coastline, how do you secure your airbase, all of those things. And one way or another, in that mix, we are finding work for a lot of very good people. And I'm delighted to say, as of this month, we're no longer just British. We are going to become an international membership, and we've acquired our first German 4-star general, which is leading to some lively conversations. And this year, I hope it'll be Germany, hopefully France and Italy, and next year into Australia. So we absolutely intend to be globally the biggest repository of full spectrum military expertise, servicing as many people as we can, consonant with our national interests. We are, to that degree, picky who we work with.
Lovely, thank you. That's just to remind the audience, you're listening to the Leadership Masterclass interview series from the IoD with me, Alastair King. This evening, I'm interviewing General Sir Richard Barrons, and this event is very kindly sponsored by Rathbones. General, a friend of mine runs the recruitment program for a major city institution. He told me that the features he looks for most favorably when he's interviewing possible new hires are, first of all, having represented their nation in a sport, and also B, having served as an officer in the military. I wonder, do we do enough to promote the military as a training ground for the commercial world? Is there still more to be done on that front?
Well, I'll confess to bearing deep scars on this point. In about 2006, I published a book. It was called The Business General. I co-authored it with an extremely talented occupational psychologist. And we devoted this book to setting out how military ways of thinking and operating, so the articulation of mission command, which is military speak for delegation and empowerment, for example, the application of the principles of war as another example, how all of these things could be applied in commercial and not-for-profit circles. And I believe that absolutely to be so, and I continue to do it now. And as soon as the book came out, we walked into a prejudice, and in my case, a stereotype. So, truth to tell, for most people in the UK of a certain age, the only general they've ever met is General Melchett in Blackadder. And if they're a bit older, they remember the Brigadier from Doctor who had a rather cute 1970s moustache. So it is not obvious to many, frankly, very talented and thoughtful people in commercial life, how the military have anything to offer the way they run their businesses. And it's just mad, because the military deal with uncertainty and complexity. They're used to dealing with being under pressure, taking decisions under conditions of great duress. They have to plan, they have to do logistics well, and they have to communicate. And for all of those reasons, many people, at whatever level they have served in the armed forces, have something to offer most organizations. And I'm delighted to say, not least through the medium of UDSS, we are proving this point, that we've fielded teams to do things like support test and tracing and other issues to do with the pandemic. But nonetheless, the fact is, most people in corporate life in the UK have so little understanding of the military. It's not obvious to them what these good people can do for them. So that's what we need to focus on.
Thank you. If I can change tack a little now, and a couple of contemporary issues, and that is, we thought we may be able to get through this interview without mentioning the word Brexit, but sadly we've just hit that particular rock. And I just wonder, what's your view as to whether Brexit has had an effect on the UK's defence partnerships or cooperation? Is there any effect on that? Is it positive? Is it negative? So
in terms of the business of defence and security, it's not had a significant effect. I mean, NATO remains the cornerstone of UK defence. Some of your members may have read NATO 2030, which is a document produced by the Secretary General in November last year. And that charts the same sort of path for the alliance as has been set out in our own national integrated review. So we're aligned with thinking with NATO, and the daily conduct of military planning, intelligence cooperation, that kind of thing, that's all worked. Where actually it has made a difference is where, like for everybody else, it just made some aspects of commercial cooperation more difficult. So take, for example, in my own case, my ambition to get most countries that are reasonably developed to buy a single synthetic environment, a replication of itself, and use it for understanding and planning and deciding and communicating, all those kinds of things. Now, if I want to take that to the European Commission or Germany, I essentially have to become German, and I need a German entity, and that previously would not have been a problem. These things can all be overcome. What I worry about more than, frankly, Brexit is, although it did expose sort of little peaks of nationalism, is the nationalism that was exposed by the pandemic. Because the only way that Europe, and you can't change geography, the only way that Europe is going to address the current lumpiness with Russia is by a collective act. You know, we will just have to accept that Russia is much more appropriately deterred, managed and constrained by more than 500 people saying, we don't want you to do that, than it is by packets of different countries with slightly different views. And that, I think, is a concern that Brexit probably hasn't helped.
And a related question would be something you mentioned earlier, which is about British soft power. Do you see, you were very acquainted with British hard power, but do you see British soft power rising or falling at this time?
So I think we should be in no doubt at all, and I addressed the point a little bit earlier in a way, which is that the way the UK is held in high esteem around the world is mostly to do with our soft power. People are interested in the BBC, in our film industry, in the Premier League, and we all spent last week, you know, gasping in horror at some of the plans for that. In our theatre, in our banking, in our insurance, in our education, all of these things. So British soft power is a far more effective way of influencing our partners and our opponents around the world to see things as we do. What we don't really do is harness that, and we tend, I think, to underplay it. But give an example: if we say to many Russian oligarchs who may be funding things that we don't want them to fund, if this means you can't bank in London, buy up Knightsbridge, put your children at school here, actually that is a far more effective way of changing their behaviour than some sort of military tub thumping or some cute cyber activity.
Mm-hmm. You run, you've mentioned a British-based consultancies and you know, selling to the world. I mean, does that British pedigree still open doors for you?
Yes, it does. I find both in Europe, within NATO, and much further afield, the British reputation is far stronger than actually the esteem we sometimes hold ourselves in. There are parts of the world which can be quite difficult. So our relationship with India historically hasn't been an easy one, and sometimes I've encountered some reservation there. But my Iraqi partners in my latter tour as a Major General in Baghdad were fascinated by, intrigued by, and attracted to the common UK military heritage that we had and the education that we offered. So I think we should see ourselves as others see us and resolve to export what we do so well far more assertively than we do now.
Just before we move to questions and answers from the audience, General, some of the things that you've been talking about can lead us to be pretty gloomy. You're talking about the rise of China, the limits of growth, and also all the threats of the digital age. I just wonder, what are your reasons to be cheerful? I mean, there was the great 1979 track in During the Blockheads, Reasons to be Cheerful, Part 3. He just listed a whole load of things why he's cheerful, even though the rest of the country wasn't at the time. What are your reasons to be cheerful that are perhaps hidden?
So I think, well, I'll come up with three. The first thing is, it looks like we're going to survive the pandemic that we knew we were going to have and then prepared really badly for. But we are going to survive it. And that's a good thing. That shows there's a certain resilience here when we're under pressure. And haven't our scientists done well, particularly in the creation of a vaccine? So that's good. Secondly, I think if you look around the world, I mean, just look at some of the dire straits some countries elsewhere in the world are in today. We have a really great life in the UK. And maybe the pandemic has reminded us not to take it for granted, maybe to prioritize it and to recognize its essential fragility. We have a really great life, but without effort, it's not self-sustaining. And the third reason to be cheerful is, despite all the constraints of a much harder world and the biggest recession for 300 years and all of that stuff, the fact is democracies have proven that they can survive, because when they get the problem, they are agile and adaptive. And so we ought to be confident that we can find a way out of these predicaments. And my concern, therefore, would be a short-term problem. But right now, we are electing not to find a way out of these predicaments, and maybe we should do a bit better.
Lovely. Thank you very much indeed. We'll now move to questions from the audience. I've got a first question, General, from Shanaz. Shanaz is asking about the cuts in the army, and she's asking about what morale, what the impact on morale is within the army following those announcements. Are you aware of how things are going there?
Oh yes. So it's never good for an army to be told that it's going to be smaller. This particular round of cuts is easier to a degree because it's going to happen over a period of time. There will be fewer amalgamations of units with tremendous heritage, and in addition to the cuts, there are some new jobs that are opening up. However, I think the issue for the morale of the army now is about how it's going to take shape for the future that we've described, because it is today at a point where it's not really been recapitalized since the 1990s, and it knows having more of the old stuff wouldn't work, but it needs the new stuff, and it needs to know how it fits into this digital world. I think for many soldiers, bear in mind the average age of the army is about 23, the day-to-day business of soldiering is always an exciting and thrilling thing. So just the low-level tactical stuff will go on, and people will be excited by it. And some of the worries that I've conveyed to you will be felt by the more senior officers. And what I would say to people is I wish I was joining the army today, because in the world I've described to you, there's no shortage of business for people who want to go soldiering and to be different and vibrant and potentially, really dangerous. But hey, that's what we do.
Lovely, thank you. We've got another sort of 12, 13 minutes left or so. We've got a decent number of questions, and so I'll try and get through as many as we can, which is excellent. So thank you for everyone's questions. I've got a question from Matthew. He's talking about asymmetrical threats from non-state actors. For example, it'd be relatively easy for a group to release a swarm of remote-controlled drones armed with small IEDs into a crowd at a sporting event, perhaps similar to the way that drugs are delivered into prisons. Traditional military capability would be entirely ineffective. I just wonder, how does an army counter those types of threats?
So I think the place to answer that question is to recognize that how harm can be delivered to us covers a very broad spectrum, and the armed forces only deal with an element of that spectrum. So asymmetric harm, for example, from a cyber attack or social media abuse and amplification, but not largely things that the military are there to deal with. And we need not to think we can create a military that will do that, because the talent to deal with those problems lies elsewhere in civil society. An element of this, however, and you mentioned swarming drones, is just an inevitable unfolding of the way technology changes how our armed forces are built and operate. So at its most extreme, we should be extremely worried that things like swarming micro drones en masse with a high explosive warhead, it will feel like a weapon of mass destruction. And indeed, the Stop the Killer Robot campaign that exists and is lobbying very actively in the UN and elsewhere is designed to stop exactly those sorts of things. But swarming drones will appear, and therefore it's not surprising there's quite a lot of investment in how do you bring them down. The asymmetric risk to the UK and other countries has to acknowledge that there are people in the world who would bring harm to us at great scale. That might be biological weapons. We've just had a pandemic. It might be nuclear waste. It might be the sort of drone-based asymmetry. And we're just going to have to manage that. It will be a team effort between the intelligence services, the armed forces, and civil society and the citizen. It's not all for the armed forces to deal with.
Thank you, General. I've got an interesting question from Alex. And Alex is asking, given that you've spent so much time developing leadership and leading extraordinary organizations, He's asking, is there a dearth of good leadership across government, business and social sectors, and how do we address that?
Yes is the answer. I think, I think some of this in both business and in government is a combination of a relatively comfortable generation or so that we've been able to live with. So I think there are, I do find leaders in government and in commercial organizations who just can't take their eyes off their boots. They can't look at the horizon and worry about how things are going to be different tomorrow. And therefore they can't articulate change before it's forced on them to their organization. I think the second critical weakness is that a lot of leaders really struggle with this idea of delegation and empowerment, that they may accept the theory that if you're running a large organization, you get most out of it by enabling every part of it to produce the maximum output, which they'll do by operating with some independence. The military system, it's called Mission Command, delivers that, often imperfectly, but it still works pretty well. And I still find senior leaders, CEOs, COOs, who are buried in a spreadsheet worrying about what time the bus is coming in the morning. And if they're doing that, then all the other things that make the organization vibrant and effective are not being done. But the killer for me in every respect are leaders who, for whatever reason, do not lead by personal example. There is nothing more damaging to an organization than a failure of moral courage and integrity, both in conveying good news and praising people and also dealing with bad news and firing people. And it's that lack of integrity at the top that I think is the killer weakness for some organizations.
Would that answer Francois's question, which is what is your definition of trust in leadership? Then is it someone that can fulfill those tasks? Would that be correct?
So I think it's based on trust and mutual respect and understanding. But leaders need good followers, and followers need good leaders, and we all move throughout our lives into different roles. But without that trust, that we are united in a common endeavor, that we will respect what each person can deliver, that where things go wrong, the blame doesn't just trickle down to the bottom of the shop, and that when things have gone well, all the riches aren't absorbed by the most senior leadership. All of those things in the round constitute an organization that functions on trust and mutual respect. If you get that, then you're going to survive most of the ups and downs of commercial and other life.
Thank you. Question from Giles. Given the German enthusiasm for Nord Stream 2 and the pipeline Nord Stream 2, is the EU really a credible structure to stand up to Russian aggression?
Well, it's an excellent question, and you would have to say right now that it's choosing not to be that. The European Union is this odd thing, a major economic force that chooses not to align political or even military power with its economic power. And there's nothing else in the world like the US or China or India that does that. And maybe that reflects the way the European Union has functioned over its existence so far. I think it is completely at odds with what we'll need the European Union as our neighbor to do in the world that's coming, that I've described to you briefly this evening. There must come a point where, to protect our own security, prosperity, vital interests and our part in the world, that the European Union finds the way of aligning genuine soft power with its economic power in order to us not simply to be swept aside on a tide of Chinese diktats, for example, about how the world of commerce is going to operate. So things like Nord Stream 2 will be, I think, and are right now, a very clear example where sometimes you've got to make very difficult choices about the right thing to do for your long-term security and prosperity and a short-term economic or political gain.
Thank you, General. I've got a question from Simran. Simran is asking, noting that you took a master's degree earlier in your career, and Simran's wondering, how do you think this adapted your leadership style?
Well, fascinating question. So when I was 29, 30, I did 2 years in education. I spent a year doing what was essentially an MBA in the defense sector. And then I spent a year at the Army Staff College being trained to be a staff officer and a future commander. The year after I finished Staff College, I ended up at a week's notice in Bosnia as the Chief of Staff of the first deployment into the campaign that became known as Operation Grapple, in conditions of immense uncertainty. Nearly all the tools I applied in working out what it is I had to do, how I had to organize it, and what the risks were from the master's degree. And the only bits that were military were things like how you actually write a movement table to shift a lot of armor up country when you needed to do it. So a way of thinking much more usefully drawn from the master's degree.
Excellent, thank you. A question from Peter. How do you think that the commitment to Europe, stroke the JEF, can be maintained when the ambition to the wider world has to be serviced by a smaller force?
Well, so the first thing is NATO is, by some standards, the world's most successful and long-lasting military alliance that most people can think of. It's in its 8th decade, but we should recognize that the creation of the Joint Expeditionary Force, which is a number of nations, mostly Middle Europe and the northern countries, to some degree reflects a concern that NATO as an alliance at 30 countries isn't getting its act together. And NATO is squabbling amongst itself whether it should worry about Russia to the east or migration, for example, from the south. So the JEF is like a localized insurance policy within NATO. However, the thing that really has changed, and I mentioned the NATO 2030 document, is that NATO as an alliance is beginning to recognize, has written down, and is thinking through that the security of the alliance has to be a global thing, that to protect our food supply, money, values, and other interests, NATO as an alliance is going to have to operate in Asia and Africa and the Gulf. Not in an Afghan way, not just by training and capacity building, but actually genuinely protecting our interests. As that argument builds, and it will, then we will all find that we're going to need different and more sorts of armed forces, because we'll quickly establish that what we have at the end of that post-Cold War trajectory of general decline and hollowing out is not going to be fit for purpose in the much more hostile world we're moving into, even when we go manned, unmanned, autonomous in the way we build combat power. So I think we're on the threshold of, out of necessity, of profound change. And I hope we can argue ourselves into making those changes and not have them forced on us by events.
Lovely. Thank you. General, question from Julian. What advice would you give the Foreign Secretary in relation to harnessing UK soft power?
So excellent question. So the Foreign Common and Development Office, very powerful thing, spends quite a lot of money and has a lot of talented people within it. But they are nothing like as powerful as the City of London or the Premier League or the BBC. So my advice to the Foreign Secretary is recognize how other countries operate and get yourself into the City of London and elsewhere and harness British soft power in a well-coordinated, well-integrated, by law if necessary, national effort, because that is how we'll protect our interests and our values.
So, we're running out of time, so just try and squeeze a couple more questions in. I think an interesting question from Ian. How has the changing nature of the threat changed the leadership competencies required in the military?
Yes, so, excellent question. So, so the thing about armed forces are they're very hierarchical and traditional, and they are essentially monopolies, and they tend to look back over their shoulder at the war they last fought for their references about how the next one is going to be fought. And you can see that playing out right now in that there are some commanders who would love to resurrect, say, the armored division of the 1980s, or the big air wings or fleets of the Cold War. And to be honest, they are very few and far between, because the hurdles you have to jump through to get to be a senior commander in the UK, or indeed any modern armed forces, mean that the less intellectually gifted, or frankly, I would like to think, are weeded out. And although they can be a bit conservative, sometimes for good reasons, we now need leaders that can lead for war in the digital age. And that means harnessing capability in a different way. The thing that never changes, and it's such an important point, is you're still fighting wars. And war is this aspect of the human condition that is brutal and feral and bloody and dangerous and uncertain and often disgusting. We still need the warrior spirit, even if sometimes it's expressed through cyber as well as a missile or a bullet.
Lovely. And just a very last quick one to squeeze in. Question from Tom. If you could recommend one book to gain a deeper understanding of good leadership, what would it be and why?
Well, honestly, I'm not sure there is one book. And I may be guilty of being you know, of being of a bit of an aficionado, particularly of Second World War history. I think any decent biography of a major leader in the Second World War is highly instructive, and I would recommend any biography of George C. Marshall, who took charge of the US Army on the day that Germany invaded Poland and handed over command just as the war ended, and then went to China in a remarkable thing as the ambassador, and finally became the defense secretary and then the Secretary of State. But that story of how he took an army that had about 4 usable divisions in 1939 and built it to 70 usable divisions and sustained for 5 years a world war is a model of a life devoted to really sophisticated leadership at all levels.
Wonderful answer. Thank you, General. General, I'm very sorry to say we've run out of time. We have a whole host of questions that people would like to have asked, so I'm sorry I haven't managed to get to all of those. I've enjoyed this interaction very much indeed. I'm very grateful to you for appearing on this interview today, and thank you very much indeed. I've enjoyed it very much indeed, General. Thank you.
My pleasure. Have a good evening, everybody.
Good news. Thank you very much, General. I thought that was really excellent, so thank you to the General. I'd like to just say a little bit about what we've got coming up. On the 10th of May, I'm interviewing, so 2 weeks today, I'm interviewing Jess Phillips MP, a leading Shadow Cabinet member. Great fun and a very lively conversation I'm sure will transpire with Jess. It always does. On the 12th of May, we've also got a event in relation to planning for flexible retirements and also to ensure your pension lasts. So that's Wednesday, the 12th of May. Also, we've got a series of other interviews coming up, which I can tell you about. I'm interviewing Kwasi Kwarteng on the 17th of May. Extraordinary, I think, interview coming up on the 24th of May, which is the with HRH Prince Khalid bin Bandar Al Saud, the Saudi ambassador for to the United Kingdom. And then the 2nd of June, I've got Alastair Campbell as well. So I just wanted to say a little bit about the IoD. It's a remarkable organisation. We have some extraordinary events occurring. We've got a legal and tax helpline which can help you in your business at any time. And I think that it's also got a remarkable professional development program which allows you to do courses, trainings and qualifications. And I just commend that to you all. And I just think we also have an excellent scope of events such as this. And I do think you should get involved. Here are the details there. Do contact them and get your membership, because I think it's 400 quid, absolutely well spent. Lovely stuff. We're 1 minute late, for which I apologise, but I think it's been an excellent evening. Thank you very much indeed for attending today. I've enjoyed it very much indeed. Thank you very much. Good night.